Usually there's stuff we have to re-record. Oh, I'm first.
I never would have picked up on that. All right, ready?
Yeah.
16 million people believe that chocolate milk came from cows.
I truly believe that.
I've been looking for pink cows on all these. I want to get the strawberry milk.
Hold on one second, Justin.
We're past the 3 strikes and you're out rule.
We forgot how to count.
Right, and I don't know if this will make it in there, but
It won't.
just is that real?
What does it feel like? Hi, welcome to another episode of Kenokla Chatter.
I'm Leah,
I'm Justin.
and today we are talking to Rick McNary, founder of Shop Kansas Farms and the Border Queen Harvest Hub. Best storyteller, I think, around, writer. I'm not sure what he doesn't do. But we sat down with him and learned a lot about our local food system.
Stay tuned. So you are a very busy guy. You're involved with a number of food projects. You're involved in beer making, in woodworking, in photography, in writing. And his book, Bite Size, did you see the rating that has on Amazon?
No.
It has a 4.9 review out of 24 reviews.
I did not make it to that. I got stuck on the wildlife pictures, actually.
Well, my wife, who loves the heck out of me, on a good day, I doubt that I could get a 4.9 review. So well done. Could you tell us a little bit about that book and the experiences that you have in it?
You bet, because it actually leads into the Border Queen Harvest. So a little over 20 years ago, I went on a mission trip to Central America, to the country of Nicaragua, and it was the first time I was ever around truly hungry people. I was walking down the street in a little barrio, and people lived in huts made out of plastic and rusted tin and wood and bricks and anything they could throw together. And a little 5-year-old girl stumbled out of one of the little houses and began begging. She started patting my pocket first, and I was told not to carry change in it. Then she pointed at my shoes, and I shook my head no, that I needed them. Then she pointed at my hat, and it was 120 that day, and I needed my hat, and I shook my head no. Then she pointed at my watch, and I'd been told to take watches and give them away. So I gave them to her, and she ran back in the house, and I heard some chatter, and I asked the person that was with me that was guiding, and I said, so what's going on? And he said, well, Dad's going to take it to the market, and they're going to sell it, and that's how they feed the family to that day. And then she came back out and held up her hands for me to pick her up. And she was beautifully filthy. Her dress was on backwards and just filthy, but hair was matted and red because of malnourishment, and her tummy was distended. I mean, she was a starving little girl. And then she finally just threw her arms around my neck, and then she whispered in my ear, feed me, I'm starving. And it just undid me, and I just promised I would do whatever I could for the rest of my life to help feed hungry people. So that book then is just a series of people and experiences along the way that kind of got me to be where I'm at right now.
And where you're at right now is also part of the Kansas Farm Bureau.
It is.
And you have a list of reasons why people should join or why you've joined.
Well, I love farmers. As I began doing things to help feed hungry people, one of the trips that I actually took was to Colombia, South America. We had sent 1 million meals down to farmers who had actually had their crops wiped out with flooding. While I was down there, a mayor in the town pointed to one of the farmers on the hillside, and he said, without them, we die. And it really hit me suddenly that if I want to be involved in fighting hunger, I need to understand where our food comes from and understand farmers. So 2015, I went to Kansas Farm Bureau and said, hey, can I write about your farmers? Because that's the best way I could learn.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I met them and fell in love with them, and just have learned that some of the things that they bring to our culture that I think are most needed is a sense of family, tradition. So if you talk to a farmer within the first couple of minutes, they will tell you where they are in a generational succession of farming. They will say, I'm a first generation, second generation, third, fourth. Usually it's I'm a fourth or fifth or sixth. So they have this sense of family and continuing on, plus the hard work that they do. Their work ethic is just amazing. They're sun up to sundown, and it's not a profession to them. It's a lifestyle. One of the things that I like best about them is they get what community is. The community, a true community, is based on survival, not on convenience. A lot of us have community based on convenience. I actually learned it in a refugee camp near the Somalia border several years ago because I was watching these refugees who were literally starving coming into the camp, and I saw them share the food that they'd been given. I thought, man, I can't even get my teenagers to share food. Why are they doing this? And the guy told me, he's like, well, they got a phrase over here in Swahili that says, today it's me and tomorrow it's you. It's reciprocity. I'll share with you today if I have it because you don't. And tomorrow it might be the roles might be reversed. So they understand community based on survival. And I think farmers get that better than any of us.
It's difficult for a lot of people to put themselves in the position of somebody who's starving, of that girl in Nicaragua. But there's a scary figure that I saw on your website that in 35 years, a lot of us could be in that same situation.
That's the Malthusian principle. Robert Malthus back in the 1800s said, our population grows at one pace and our agricultural productivity has to keep pace with that. And they projected by 2050, so that date 35 years was a few years back, but still 2050 is when we reach that 9 billion inhabitants on this planet. And so agricultural production has to increase enough to feed that 9 billion. And that's the challenge that farmers and ranchers face every day because, when it hits that, what are we going to do to sustain?
But by building up to that big a production, that can also have environmental impact.
Sure.
And is that one of the reasons why you look at having sustainable practices where people can locally source their food?
You bet. And one of the things I've learned in working with farmers and ranchers and writing, because I'd show up at their house at 6 o'clock in the morning and drink coffee around their coffee table. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't. But what I learned about them is the idea of sustainability is baked into who they are. It's not a clever marketing term because when I mentioned earlier, they want their 10th and 11th generation to continue farming. And so one of the fears that I learned every farmer and rancher has is losing the farm on their watch. So imagine you've been passed down something that grandma and grandpa, great-grandma and grandpa farmsteaded in 1862, and you can't, you lose it in yours, so that's a big fear. So sustainability is a huge issue. And so, no-till and the variety of things that farmers are very creative and very inventive. Conservation practices, they take a bad rap sometimes from a few that are disgruntled for whatever reasons and are, activists against them. But farmers large, the ones that I know, are deeply concerned about the environment and do all that they can because they want their great-great-great-grandchildren farming too.
I'm curious about what was the reaction. Did you say you started visiting farms in 2015?
Correct.
What was the reaction in the beginning? Is it the same now of you going out and meeting them where they are? Were they pretty open, or were they at first like, why? Why are you here? What are you doing? What are you hoping to accomplish? Or were they more like, finally, someone is helping share this story, something that we've been working on all along?
That's a great question, and I was very well received, but there were a couple of things that had happened before that, and that one of the things I had done for a number of years were called meal packaging events. One of the things I love to do is give volunteers an opportunity to do something practical to help fix whatever social issues out there. For me, it was hunger. So there were these meal packaging events, and we'd line people up around tables, and they'd put products, like we had a rice and bean meal, so it was a little assembly line. And volunteers of all ages could assemble the rice and the soy and the vitamin pack, and then they'd seal it in a bag and put it in a box. I did millions of those meals all over the United States. And so I had that reputation with the Farm Bureau of caring about the hungry. I'd done a lot of events with the Farm Bureau. But I was actually at an FFA conference in 2015. A friend of mine invited, I was serving in a group in D.C. called the Alliance to End Hunger, and the FFA government director said, have you ever been to an FFA convention? And it's like, yeah, no. I don't really know much about them other than they wear these really cool blue jackets. They're Future Farmers of America stuff. And he's like, I thought he was going to hurt me. He's like, you have not? You've got to be kidding, you know? So I went to Louisville, and I kept hearing them say, we need to tell our story better. And I'm driving home from Louisville, that 10, 11-hour stretch, and I'm thinking, you know, I like to write. Maybe I can help tell their story. So I approached Kansas Farm Bureau. So they already knew me from the hunger space or the things that I did with that, and knew that I had pure motives. I wanted to know and learn about agriculture, and I wasn't going to turn it into a witch hunt. I was not an activist against them, and so I was well received, but at the same time, and I'd go visit farmers, I would often have to say, I'm not an investigative journalist.
Right.
I'm a storyteller. I'm the guy in the balcony that's manning the spotlight, and I found you, and I wanna let the world know who you are, because along the way I fell in love with them and who they are and what they stand for, and so I do everything I can to shine a spotlight on them.
As someone who is, I always say that I grew up in a small town. I did not grow up on a farm. There's a big difference.
Absolutely.
Small town versus you grew up on a farm. So I'm wondering, and I think I've seen a little bit of it, but I'm wondering if you've seen it on like a larger scale since you've been all around the world in Kansas. Do farmers have a network of each other? Do they know, like, oh, I can just call so-and-so? Are they their resources for things that they need to know? Is that where they go to other farmers?
Yes, it is a fraternity or a sorority of such. You know, only 2% of the world of Americans are farmers. 2% of the population.
Wow.
Who are feeding 100% of us. So it's a pretty small group. And so, yes, they do know each other. And, of course, they have associations like Kansas Farm Bureau, you know, which has a lot. It is in every county. It's in every county in the nation, actually, you know. And so they've got a huge network. So they're connected to each other. They have resources and learn from each other. So, yeah, they're well connected.
Did you know why Harvard has Harvard Yard?
No. You and the things you know. No.
That's where they used to feed their cows. So they would go teach a class, and they would bring their cattle to graze while they were in classes. So just the history of the U.S. is definitely, you know, it's steeped in farms and agriculture. And just to see, you know, how much it has shifted and pulled away.
When America was founded, those numbers were reversed. 98% of the people were involved in agriculture, and only 2% lived in the urban areas. So as that divide has switched or created because of that switch, there is an incredible disconnect. In fact, in 2016, I read a study that said that 16 million people believe that chocolate milk came from brown cows.
It doesn't? I've been looking for pink cows on all these. I want to get the strawberry milk.
Is that real?
It is. It is a study that was done. And so
On elementary kids or?
No.
Oh my gosh.
general population.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Well, at
read
least
that.
growing up in a small town, at least I made it that far. I did know that.
Knowing that that was a reality for some, as much as I disbelieved it, we had grandkids. We had 5 grandkids at the time, my wife and I, and we decided to start, we call it the McNary Cousins. That's who our grandkids are. They're all cousins, of course. A McNary Cousins Farm and Ranch Tour. And we take them to farms and ranches because they live in cities, and we want them to know where their food comes from. To segue into the Border Queen Harvest Hub, one of the things that I learned in the realm of agriculture as I was trying to study, I'd go to conferences, and I asked at one of the conferences about the sign along I-70 up by Lawrence to Kansas City. It says, Kansas farmers feed 155 people plus you. And I said, that's really cool. So this is like back in 2011. Dr. Kurt Kastner, the Kansas State Food Science Director, he asked me if I knew what a food system was. And I was like, well, I'm involved in hunger stuff around the world. Yeah, I've heard the phrase. He's like, it boils down to three things: production, processing, and distribution. And he said they were really interested at the time of somebody that could create a local food system. And he said that at the time, he was serving on the Department of Homeland Security's task force of trying to have these local food systems as backup mechanisms, resilient mechanisms in case of a terroristic threat to the global food supply chain.
Right.
Well, this is way before the pandemic. And so for some reason, and he kind of threw that challenge out to me. He's like, if you can figure out how to do that, I'll get you in front of Janet Napolitano, who was the director at the time. Well, that wasn't my motivation, but the idea of how I could do that was really intriguing. So I just started researching, went to K-State a lot, talked to a lot of profs, went to conferences, read everything I could. How do you start a local food system? A couple of things I noticed as I started working on it. One was that if you're going to do it in our culture, you need a digital hub. If you're going to connect those three things, that's just the way our world works. If you're going to connect producers, processors, and distributors, there needs to be a centralized digital hub. The second thing is I researched, it's like the processing component. So the small meat processors were disappearing. And if you wanted your cattle produced, they had to go to one of the big meat plants, and then, you didn't get it back. And so the small ones, and then there were no commercial kitchens, or very few commercial kitchens. At the time I started working on the idea of creating a local system was in 2011. There were 11 commercial kitchens.
11 in the U.S. or in Kansas?
In Kansas. That number stayed there for a long time. So I'm watching this develop, and I wrote models, and I pounded square pegs into round holes for years trying to figure out how do we get commercial kitchens or canneries. Then the pandemic hit, and we just finished eating a dinner of great beef that we bought from a ranch couple, Craig and Katie Carruthers over in Anthony. And my wife and I were watching a Hallmark movie. This is April 28th of 2020, when the pandemic was just punching everybody right in the mouth. Mm-hmm. A lot of fear. The only thing.
I have a bloody lip.
Yeah, don't we all? And we're watching a Hallmark movie because it's the only thing that's positive. As predictable as it is, you still walk away feeling good. It's like, okay, we're not all going to die tonight. So we're watching this, and my wife says, hey, the meat counter was empty at the grocery store today. She'd gone to Sam's, I think. I was like, what? I'm, 62 years old. I'd never seen a meat counter empty or a grocery store empty. And I thought about it, and so I reached over and grabbed my laptop, and I thought, well, I know all these farmers because I'd met them, written about them, that were selling direct to consumers. I knew they had stuff, like the Carruthers, KCK Farms and Anthony. I knew they still had stuff, and I thought, well, maybe I can connect some of my friends to these farmers and ranchers that I know. So I've got some marketing and sales background. You name it what you want people to do. And if you're trying to do sales, so it's like, well, shop Kansas Farms. And I started a Facebook group, and it said you had to have at least one rule. So I made one rule up that I swiped from my kindergarten teacher, niece, and that was be kind and share, or else you'll end up in timeout. I thought it was kind of cute. And then I had to have a mission, and that was to connect you to the wonderful farm and ranch families of Kansas so you can purchase the food they raise. Simple enough. So I started it at 6:58 on April 28th in the evening, and checked back, invited a few of my friends. I reached out to some of the farmers I knew and said, hey, I'm going to start this. They're like, okay, whatever. We're trying to do stuff too. And so I checked back 3 hours later, and it had 400 members.
Wow.
Yeah.
Surprise.
And there were 5,000 by the next night.
And how much toilet paper was being exchanged in that network?
Well, great question, because I learned really quick how everything people had they wanted to sell, they tried to put on there. Or people were looking for things that were not food related.
Oh.
And since my mission was to connect you to purchase the food they raise, then it was like, okay, we can't allow that. We can't do that. But it was a Wild West social media rodeo that first day. Now, that meal packaging thing that I mentioned that I did, I actually, that next day, began working with the Kansas Department of Emergency Management and the Kansas National Guard to package food for hungry people who were being affected out in the meat packing plants because they were COVID clusters out there, and they were having to sequester these people. So on one hand, I'm helping feed hungry people out in western Kansas that have lost their jobs temporarily because they can't be around anybody, and then Shop Kansas Farms takes off. I'm a busy guy, I have no idea how to run one of these things, a social media site. So Megan Kramer, Director of Communications for Kansas Farm Bureau, whom I had been writing for years, reached out and said, you need some help? And her and another lady named Nancy Brown with Kansas Farm Bureau reached out and said, we can help. I go, please. I have no idea. So they started putting structure in place. So what Megan and Nancy did was help us we learned that you could put rules in place, and also you had to approve every post. That was huge. That was a policy and process issue. One of the things that I learned, leadership principle I learned years ago, is how to move people from chaos into productivity. Mm-hmm. There's 3 basic steps. When people start getting in that, you got to have shared vision. You get people to join around a shared vision, then establish some policies and processes, and then also some role definitions. Those 3 things will work you out of most trouble you get into as an organization, or even sometimes as a family. Figure out those things. It's one of the most valuable I learned. So we started, our mission is to connect people to food that are raised. So that was pretty simple. Sorry if you have toilet paper for sale, not here.
When I look at everything that you're into, the photography, the writing, the sharing recipes, sharing how to make beer, the different breweries that you can go to. It's all about establishing community. Mm-hmm. And it's all about bringing people into that scene where they can see where you took the photo. Bring them into the world where you have that story, that connection. And now with the Border Queen Harvest Hub, about creating that sense of community there as well. And it just seems to permeate throughout everything that you do.
Thanks for noticing, Justin. It's deliberate. It's intentional. Before the pandemic, or as the pandemic took off, my oldest son out in Colorado called up and he said, Dad, you need to start a community because that's what you like to do. I was like, wait, we can't get within 6 feet of each other. How do you make that happen? And about the 3rd day of Shop Kansas Farms, there were 2 big revelations to me when it was taken off. We'd hit about 13,000 members by Thursday morning. Mm-hmm. And I realized, one, I had created a digital hub. I didn't do it on purpose. It wasn't some clever marketing thing. It's like, oh, I created that hub. And in fact, to this day, if you look at our Facebook group, you will see those 3 things of the producer, the processor, and the distribution. All of those 3 things are being accomplished in every post that's put up. A guy who says, I have hogs, and they're going to the Clay Center market, and you can pick them up. All 3 of those things happen in that sentence. The other thing that I saw was I was creating a community. Because of I've had so much experience in the hunger space, I realized what was going on in those first several weeks. People were afraid. It was fear. They were coming to get food. They didn't know where it was going to be. And so that sense of community that was being built, it gets back to that today it's me and tomorrow it's you. People understood. In fact, I actually wrote an article, a national op-ed for a group called AgriPulse out of D.C., and it was titled Kansas Farmers Calm Public Fears. Lady called up, the editor was like, what's going on? And I said, farmers are calming public fears. They're like, hey, we're still farming. We got it right here. The model for the Border Queen Harvest Hub is built on 2 tracks. One is economic development. It's got to be good to help farmers and ranchers make money. I saw a guy at a conference this weekend, and he walked up to introduce me to somebody else, and he said, this guy, and he pointed at me and said, made me a lot of money. And he's a farmer. Like, dude, I like to hear that because I know that's what they're trying to figure out how to do. But the other component of this is community development, community engagement. And that's based on Stanford University's collective impact model. So Stanford University went around years ago and said, okay, all these communities are trying to move a needle on something. You know, it might be high school graduation rates or dropout, whatever, hunger, whatever. Who's really moving the needle? So what they found is they'd go to these communities, and the communities were, various groups within them were saying they were moving their own needle.
Right.
You know, they'd come up with their own, here's my standard, and I moved it. So would some foundation or granting agency give me more money because I moved my needle? And that needle might be very different than the person next to him that was coming up with their own set of metrics and measurements. And so Stanford says the people who are really moving the needle are working together collectively. And so there were 5 things. And so the Border Queen Harvest Hub is built on these 5 things. One is the shared or the common agenda. Think of the shared vision thing. It's a common agenda. You know what we're about. The other one is shared measurements. And one of the beautiful things that Stacy Davis with the Sumner County Economic Development and the Sumner County Economic Commission did was right off the bat, before we really got out of the gate, Stacy said, what can I do to help you? And I said, we need somebody collecting data for us because this has to be data driven. We've got to prove. And there's not data being collected on the things that we're going to be doing. It's our own unique. It's that shared measurement thing. So I got in front of the county commissioners and I said, if you guys could, give Stacy some help to pay somebody. So across the street in the Caldwell workspace is Lori Barnes, who has been working furiously for a year collecting data for us. So that shared measurements, and it gives us a baseline to which we measure the future. You guys know you're in business. You measure what you work what you measure. So the other component.
He's thinking right now that, no, I measure things and Leah goes on vibes. I know you were thinking
I was like, here's the stats. And you're like, but what does it feel like? Those first 2 steps, it made me think of a race. If let's say that if you have a relay race, you might have 4 people on your team, but one, you have to have a shared vision. You have to agree what the direction is that you're going. So like if half your team are running the opposite direction, you're not going to be successful. But then also with the metrics, like you have to know that you're running a 100-yard dash. So you have to be able to know when the finish line is, and you also need to know what your times are so then you can improve it for the next time.
Yeah.
I'm sure all the rest of those steps will also go well with racing. We'll see.
Actually, they will. So the third one is mutually reinforcing activities. So where one thing is supporting the other. So in a community engagement thing, when you think about how one thing helps support the other, one group helps support the other, then you start looking and identifying this is part of going after that common agenda and the shared measurements. The 4th step in there is continuous communication. You guys are both communicators, Communication's difficult. As many platforms as we currently have, it's more difficult, I think, to reach people than ever before.
I truly believe that.
Because there's just so many different ways. 5th point of the community engagement is the idea of a backbone organization. So that's where the Border Queen Harvest Hub comes into play. So as we had written this model and looking for implementing it, Karen Sturm had met me at a market of farms we had in Lyons, and she said, you need to come down to Caldwell. Well, I was still really busy doing the meal packaging thing and I had another job. It's like, no.
But Karen didn't care, did she?
No.
She said, no, you need to come to Caldwell.
And kept saying, no, you need to go. It's like, okay, fine.
Shout out to Karen. We love it. I remember this chamber meeting where she talked about you.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. So I didn't want to come. I just was busy. I loved her, and thought that Caldwell's a great place. Never really been here. And then I came down and met the folks from Vision Caldwell. And so I shared my vision for what this looked like. And then through Shop Kansas Farms, in that process, I had actually sold Shop Kansas Farms to Kansas Farm Bureau because it was getting too much for me. And it's like, to have a future and to have the resources and the connections, it needs some organization. Went to talk to them, and I said, I think there's, I love you guys. I have a relationship with you. I'm not offering it to anybody else, even though I had another offer. It's like, I'm not going to do it. Would you guys take it if you want it? And they did. And they spatially saw it being really beneficial to helping rural areas. So they bought it from me, but they loved this idea of this local food system or the Harvest Hub. So because of Vision Caldwell and Karen Sturm and especially Jill Keeney, their vision for this, and I met with the team, and so we went to Patterson Family Foundation and asked for a grant to help implement one down here. And because it's Caldwell and the Border Queen, it became known as the Border Queen Harvest Hub. Mm-hmm. One thing I'd like to leave people with who are listening is please go buy from your local farmers and ranchers. And if you have to pay a little bit more, remember that you're keeping their kids in school, you're helping them pay the bills on the farm, and it's not buying some CEO, a third or fourth home. These are people that are hammering it out day in and day out, and your support, even if it's once or twice a year, you purchase something from them. And if you can't afford to purchase something, share their Facebook, make comments on it, share their website, just support them. Let them know that you like what they're doing, and by all means, try to figure out who they are and fall in love with them like I have.
When I was growing up, I was just thinking, we never bought from local farmers because the only thing that I heard about was like they're buying half a cow at a time or a steer. Sorry if I used the wrong terminology there. And that's just not something that my family prepped for or could do financially. But now this direct-to-consumer, like a lot of, if we go down to Hager Acres or any of these local farms, you don't have to buy in giant bulk. Right. You can go down and buy the same amount you would buy, at the Spice Merchant right down here at Kimmy's.
Exactly. So it's adjusting to the market, adjusting to the consumer expectations and relationship.
Right. And I don't know if this will make it in there, but
it won't.
just to tag on to that, it is super affordable. These options that are out there, it's not buying half a hog or anything like that. It's buying a small batch of honey or spices or farm fresh eggs or somebody making sourdough. It's unreal the amount of options that you have, that we have in the Border Queen right down the street.
Kimmy, Hagar, and Hagar Acres is amazing. Also over in Belle Plaine is the Ellis Island, and they're doing the same thing. It's a lady bringing stuff together. They're part of the Border Queen Harvest Hub.
And you can shop. That's part of it, right? You can go to the website, and it's direct to consumer. You can buy it right there.
You find the farmers to buy it from. You don't buy it from us. But borderqueenharvesthub.com is where you go, and it'll list the farmers that are there. And you go talk to them and buy from them. We're not the middleman. That's where they lose their money. That's good to know. That's where they lose their money, is on the middleman. We're not the middleman. We're the connector.
I think something that's great to, kind of pull out and see is that you're a writer, you're a photographer, you're a foodie, and like if we look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have really reached that self-actualization, and your mission is community and food, and it's all about helping people get their basic needs met, because a number of us will never reach that level if we're on the ground hungry and just fighting over crumbs. And ultimately, like, your mission is not just about combating hunger. It's also about enabling people to actually reach their best selves.
100%.